Hello everyone, back tuning into our latest Star Wars video. So I've just come back from seeing episode 9, Star Wars episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. And I thought I'd post a few early thoughts. I'll probably do a proper review in a couple of days' time. I've had a bit of a think about it. It's quite a confusing sort of film. So I think it will need a little while to digest what I've seen and have a think about it, really. I think, so let's deal with the good points first of all. I think it's probably the best of the sequel trilogy, actually. Because it does actually feel like Star Wars. So, I mean, that is a start, isn't it? The other two films, particularly The Last Jedi, to me, they didn't really feel like Star Wars at all. This one does actually feel like it is a Star Wars film. So that is a start. It's a beginning, I suppose. But it could be the worst although it's the best of the sequels, it may be that it's the worst of the whole saga, really. But it's the worst of the 9 films, because there is a lot in there that really rips up what's gone before. Talk about that in a moment. Also, they've given up on the sort of trashy dialogue, the Joss Whedon style backwards and forwards banter rubbish that was in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. They've discarded most of that, mainly because it moves at such a fast pace. There's just not the time, I don't think, to have that sort of nonsense backwards and forwards that they had in the other 2 films. So that's been thrown in the bin, and the dialogue is much more traditional for a Star Wars film. So that also makes it feel like you are actually watching a Star Wars film. And other good points about this, they have, there will be spoilers in this, by the way. They have pretty much thrown away what happened in The Last Jedi. So there are various plot points that happen in The Last Jedi that are reversed in this film. You remember that the first time we see Luke in The Last Jedi, he throws the lightsaber away like it's a piece of rubbish. In this one, Rey throws the lightsaber away and Luke catches it and gives it back to her. So that is very much J.J. Abrams saying to Rian Johnson, this isn't how Luke should be behaving. Luke would not throw the lightsaber away. So that doesn't, of course, make up for what went before, but a lot of fans were very unhappy about the way Luke just threw the lightsaber away like it's a piece of rubbish. That is fixed with this one. They also fix Rey's backstory in The Last Jedi. She's revealed as a nobody. She was sold for drinking money, and she has no part in the story. She's actually told by Kylo Ren to her face that you are a nobody, you're nothing. In this one, it's revealed that she does, in fact, have a backstory, and she's revealed to be the granddaughter of Palpatine. The Emperor, who is back in this as well. More on that in a moment. So they have gone out of their way, really, to fix a lot of what's gone before in The Last Jedi. All of the things that the fans were very unhappy about with The Last Jedi are primarily fixed or discarded or just ignored. One little issue is with Rose Tico, who was a character in The Last Jedi that had a lot of criticism, probably quite unfair criticism, really. Any problems that she had in The Last Jedi was primarily down to Rian Johnson's silly writing and not knowing how to present the character, really. And Kelly Marie Tran, the actress, did get a lot of criticism personally. And with this, they've sort of parked her character, so she's in it, but she's only in it very, very briefly. And probably a bit unfair what they've done there. Actually, she could have had a slightly bigger role in this, I think. But they have pretty much discarded everything that went from everything that happened in The Last Jedi as best they can. So this really is a sequel to The Force Awakens more than The Last Jedi, to be honest. And The Last Jedi is kind of like, as best it can, just a very bad memory. Of course, there are certain things they can't fix, which is the fact that Luke was killed at the end of The Last Jedi. He dies, and in this one, he is back. He has a scene, he has a couple of scenes, one right at the very end of one earlier on in the film. And he's a Force ghost, so pretty much the only thing they could do with him after we've seen him dead, the only other way they could fix that would be to just remake Episode 8, The Last Jedi, which a few people have suggested they ought to have done. But he's back as a Force ghost. He doesn't really have that much to do, but his character is much better. It's much more the Luke that we know. As I say, he catches the lightsaber in this one and gives it back to Rey rather than throwing it away. So those are two quite important points. The dialogue is much better. They've fixed a lot of the problems with The Last Jedi. But there are big problems with The Rise of Skywalker as well. The main problem is the return of the Emperor, the return of Palpatine. There is no explanation for why the Emperor is back, why he returns, how has he survived being thrown down the chasm at the end of Return of the Jedi and then being blown up. Presumably he may have survived the fall, but then he gets blown up when the Death Star gets blown up. So he's survived all of that, and he's back in this one, but there's no explanation for why that's the case. I think it's kind of implied, but he might be some sort of undead sort of zombie or something, but there's no sort of explanation for that at all. There is a line that they steal from Revenge of the Sith, where Palpatine says that the dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural, and that's about the only explanation that you get. So I suppose it might be implied, but it's got something to do with Darth Plagueis, who was the Sith before Palpatine, who managed to cheat death, supposedly had the power to cheat death. But there's no sort of explanation about that. And I've always said that this film will rise or fall on how they bring back Palpatine, because of course what this does is it creates so many issues for how Return of the Jedi ended. And the story of the Chosen One. Anakin Skywalker is the Chosen One. He's been created by the Force to bring the Force back into balance by killing the Sith. And he does that at the end of Return of the Jedi. He fulfills the prophecy. He dies in doing that, of course. But he fulfills the prophecy. The Sith are destroyed. End of story. Well, of course, if Palpatine didn't die at the end of Return of the Jedi, then that whole story arc of the Chosen One and of Anakin's redemption, Darth Vader's redemption, and fulfilling the prophecy, that is thrown out. It's thrown in the bin. So that's a big issue in this story. And as I say, there's no explanation for why the Emperor is back. So that kind of is just he's just back, and that's all there is to it. I still think there's a fundamental issue with these people who are making these films for Disney, with J.J. Abrams and, of course, Rian Johnson with The Last Jedi, and with Kathleen Kennedy. All of these people do not understand the story that George Lucas has established. They don't understand the Sith, they don't understand the Jedi. So they are making the film up as they're going along, and that's very obvious, but they had no plan previously to bring back the Emperor. It's not set up in any way in the previous two films. If they had a real plan to bring back the Emperor, he would have come back in, or it would have been implied or hinted that his return is possible in the earlier films. There's no setup. He's just back at the beginning. It's right at the very start of The Rise of Skywalker. He's there. But there's no setup for that in the earlier films. So quite obviously they are making the whole thing up as they're going along. They're not giving any thought to what they're doing. And they killed off, of course, Snoke. There's no explanation for Snoke either. Palpatine just says that he created Snoke. I created Snoke. But there's no sort of explanation behind that. How did he create him? Who is Snoke? Where did he fit into the story? It's implied that Palpatine is kind of like a puppet master pulling his strings. But again, there's no sort of explanation about that whatsoever. And he's, of course, set up as the main villain in the first two films of this trilogy. So, as a trilogy, it is a total mess, really, and there's nothing that The Rise of Skywalker could do to fix that, because the other two films were so at odds with one another, and this one is now at odds with The Last Jedi. There's no way to get around that as a trilogy, they don't work. As a trilogy, they're a mess. But at least this one does feel like a Star Wars film. It feels like it could be a conclusion to the six films would have gone before, in a way. But again, there's just so many problems with The Emperor's Return versus what happened at the end of Return of the Jedi, and the way that it sort of now makes Anakin's arc and Vader's arc completely pointless, really. And it's all about Rey. Rey is now the one who finally defeats the Emperor and gets rid of the Sith. So obviously the prophecy of the Chosen One was wrong. Anakin's sacrifice was pretty much for nothing. His sacrifice at the end of Return of the Jedi was for nothing. In fact, the whole of the Skywalker seemed pretty pointless, really, at the end of this. Luke, I mean, what role has he played in it? Very little. Leia is there. They do manage to bring her back. It's quite nice to see Carrie Fisher in the scenes that she did for The Force Awakens that weren't used, and they've used them in a different context for this one. That's quite nice, I thought. Nice way to include her. But really, getting down to it, this Star Wars now is like the story of the Palpatines, which seems very odd and very strange. It's like the story of the Emperor and his granddaughter. And everything that we thought Star Wars was about, with the Skywalkers, with Anakin, Vader, Luke, Leia, that kind of, like, at the end of this, seems a little bit, just a little bit pointless, and like, it was all for nothing. Everything that happened in the originals and the prequels and the two previous films before this one probably was kind of nothing for nothing. So it's quite a strange film. And again, there are things that go against the Jedi teachings as well. So I won't go into this in this video, but there is an issue about death and about life, and what George Lucas has established, which is that the Jedi are supposed to accept death. The Jedi accept that things come and go within a person's life, and sort of they shouldn't be greedy and hold on to things. They should accept the fact that people come and go and sort of embrace death, and by doing so, they are able to live beyond death, so they are able to live in an afterlife, whereas the Sith are seeking immortality and seeking to live forever, I suppose. So there's an issue with this one where a character at the end dies and is brought back to life, which and it sort of goes against what's been established. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a review I'm going to do in a couple of days' time. But it's a big problem with what's been established in the previous two trilogies in George Lucas's trilogy. So it's mixed. I would say out of the sequel trilogy, it's the best one because it does feel like a Star Wars film. So that is a start. It feels like you are actually watching Star Wars. But again, in terms of a 9-part saga, it might be the worst one for what it does, particularly to the end of Return of the Jedi. The prequels come out of this not too bad because they are mostly ignored, to be honest. The only thing with that is Anakin's story of being the Chosen One, and the prophecy and the Force creating him to bring balance to the Force by getting rid of evil, getting rid of the Sith. So that is sort of thrown away with this. But otherwise, the prequels don't come out too bad because they're primarily ignored with these sequel trilogies. We know Disney doesn't like the prequels at all. But in terms of the originals, actually it is the original films that suffer, although these films have been made as like almost, certainly Force Awakens was J.J. Abrams' love letter to Star Wars A New Hope. it's actually the original films that suffer the most, and particularly Return of the Jedi suffers a great deal with this particular film, because everything that we see at the end of Return of the Jedi, Anakin's sacrifice, the death of the Emperor, it feels like it's all been in vain and all been for nothing, basically. Lando Calrissian is back. That's another good point about this film. The way they introduce Lando is quite good. Billy D. Williams, he's over 80 years old, but he's still quite good in his role. Music-wise, again, rather forgettable score, as has been the case with the previous two sequel films. There's something about these directors that they just don't work with John Williams. The only memorable moments within the score are the reprises of past music. There's quite a lot of that. And sometimes, actually, it takes you out of what's going on and what you're seeing. And sometimes even the reprises don't have a great deal to do with the characters that are on screen. So a couple of times we hear Princess Leia's theme from the original trilogy, but in a context that doesn't have a great deal to do with what you're actually seeing. So the score, again, it's as it has been with these sequel films. John Williams has not worked well, I don't think. Might be because he's at a grand age and he hasn't got the sort of energy now to do a full 2-hour, 20-minute score. So they're having to reprise a lot of the old things. But it might be that, but I think mainly it's down to the fact that the directors that they've got for these films are just not working with John Williams in the way that George Lucas used to work with him. And I think that is one of the big things that's gone wrong with these sequel trilogy films. There is the final act, the third act, gets very, very over the top. If you just sit back and sort of take it for what it is kind of enjoyable. But it's so fast-paced and it's very hard to keep up with what you're actually seeing, what's going on. There are very few moments for characters to sit down and reflect on what's happening. You know, those quiet moments that you have in the Star Wars films, particularly in George Lucas's Star Wars films, quiet moments of reflection and sitting back and sort of taking in what's happened before you move on to the next action sequence. In this one, it's just one action sequence after another action sequence after another action sequence with very little time to breathe in between. And so it all just becomes one huge conflated sort of blob of things being thrown at your senses in terms of what you're seeing visually and in terms of what you're seeing and what you're hearing. And that's particularly so in the third and final act, which does get extremely over the top. And what else am I going to say? So that's pretty much it for this video, I think. So it definitely mixed. If I was rating it out of 5, it would probably be a 2. If I was rating it out of a 10, it would probably be a 4. So I'm not terribly impressed with it. It's a little bit better than particularly The Last Jedi, but also The Force Awakens, actually. I think it's the best of the sequel trilogy. But for what it does to established lore, in terms of Star Wars lore, and what it does to establish character points, and particularly the ending of Return of the Jedi, there are huge problems with this film. Right, so I think that's enough for this video. I'll have a little bit more of a think about it and have something a little bit more typical for a review for you in a couple of days' time, probably. But that's my early sort of take on Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. Right, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.